Hi, welcome everyone. I think we're going to get started. My name is Brinda Sarathi. I am a professor at Pitzer College in environmental analysis, and I also direct the Redford Conservancy for Southern California Sustainability. I wanted to welcome the parents who are in the audience visiting their maybe not so little ones at college. Welcome back, and welcome if this is your first time here. Wanted to welcome any alum who might be in town, friends of the Conservancy. You really are both moral and financial support, and look forward to having you help guide us. Welcome to friends and colleagues in the audience. I wanted to recognize Jackie Sullivan. This speaker series we have every February in memory of former professor at Pitzer College, John Sullivan, affectionately known as Jack Sullivan. He was a professor in political science, and when I first came to Pitzer College, he would always come by my door to get me or to ask me, are you going to teach a class on water? And water was not my thing. Many of you know I did labor, race, and forestry. And Jack would say, well, people need to know about water in California. And of course, I ended up catching the water bug from Jack. I teach Hustle and Flow. It's a really great class. I've got students in the audience from Hustle and Flow. And when Jack passed, Jackie and I spoke, and we said we need to do something to help spread his passion for water. It's something that will never be drab. And we were really successful in launching the Sullivan Memorial Lecture. This is, I believe it's the third year we're doing it, and I'm so very excited about the speaker today. Before I introduce our speaker, I wanted to just take a moment to also remember Stuart McConnell, a professor at Pitzer College Emeritus in history, who passed away on Valentine's Day. And I think Stuart would really have enjoyed the talk today, given his love of language, his commitment to facts and history and sources. And so just want to also dedicate this lecture today to Professor McConnell. So in the world of journalism, Mark Arax stands out as a rarity. He is both a skilled investigative reporter as well as a gifted writer whose feature stories and books are distinguished by his vivid characters and magnetic language. Like the legendary Carrie McWilliams, Mark digs deep into the dirt of the Golden State and finds tragedies, and I would also say kind of the comedies hidden from most Californians. With equal passion, he has chronicled both the plight of farm workers and farmers. We just had lunch earlier, and I found out that his grandfather was a committed member of the Communist Party, whose first job in the US was picking fruits and vegetables, who later went on to found two very successful, it sounds like, fruit and vegetable shops in the Berkeley area. His father, Ara, was born on a raisin farm outside Fresno, and Mark has also written compellingly about his journey to find the story behind his father's murder. His father was an owner of a nightclub, and so just really interesting and compelling paths into journalism. Mark is the author of multiple award-winning books. His best-selling King of California, about the fortunes of the Boswell farming family, won the 2004 California Book Award and the 2005 William Saroyan International Writing Prize. And I have no doubt that his forthcoming book, coming out this May, The Dreamt Land, Chasing Water and Dust Across California, will be equally compelling. And we're very fortunate that this is the first coming out of The Dreamt Land, and Pitzer College is fortunate and honored that we get to sponsor that. Based on an excerpt I had read, it was late last fall in the California Sunday magazine. I was so taken with this description of what was happening in the Central Valley in relation to the Resnicks. You know, I immediately looked Mark up and I said, can you please come and give the Sullivan lecture? And he was so kind and generous in accepting that offer. And I know that after reading that piece, I will never be able to look at a cutie or a pomegranate the same way again. A top graduate of Fresno State and Columbia University, Mark left the Los Angeles Times in 2007 after a public fight over censorship on his story about the Armenian Genocide. He has taught literary nonfiction at Claremont McKenna College and Fresno State University and served as the senior policy director for the California Senate Majority Leader. We are so very honored to have him here with us today. Please welcome Mark Arax.
Brenda, can I take you on the road with me here? We'll, as I do this book tour, it'd be perfect. We'd be a good 1-2 team. Thank you. Ms. Sullivan, it's an honor to be here in the name of your husband. I've heard so many incredible things about him over the past today and did some online research, so thank you so much. It's great to be here. How many of you are here under duress? In other words, a professor is requiring you to be here? Okay, good to know, good to know. My only hesitation was this is a lecture, and I'm not going to lecture. I'm kind of a storyteller, so I'm going to tell some stories, talk some, read some, and then we're going to do hopefully a very lusty Q&A. This is the first time I'm kind of presenting this book, so I don't have all my paces down, so it can get a little rough here and there. So just hold with me. I'll check the yawns out there, and I'll be able to figure out, how you guys are following things and all that. Let me begin with the question. How many of you have a grandparent who came to the U.S. from a foreign land? And that's pretty extraordinary, probably half. Okay. Well, that was the case with my grandparents on both sides. They hailed from the ancient kingdom of Armenia. Of course, there was no ancient kingdom of Armenia when they were born into the 20th century. They were subjects of the Ottoman Turkey, who had arrived more than 1,000 years after they got there. And at the dawn of the 20th century, that empire, the Ottoman Empire, was crumbling, and the Armenians and the Greeks became a convenient scapegoat. And in 1915, from 1915 to 1918, an estimated 1.5 million Armenians were massacred, sent on death marches. It was a precursor to the Holocaust. It was the first genocide of the 20th century. My grandfather, on my paternal side, survived by hiding in an attic. He was 15 at the time, and he took up a couple books of literature, French symbolist literature, Verlaine, Baudelaire, Maupassant. And he hid up there for a year. He was helped because he lived in Constantinople, which was an international city, and the massacres did not take place there with the same kind of ferocity they did in the interior of Turkey, the saddleback of Turkey. So still though, he was at 15, 16, was going to be conscripted in the military and sent to the interior to be killed, so he hid in the attic. When he came down, obviously the whole terrain had changed. And he was 18, and he took a job at a bookstore in Constantinople. And there were some Armenian poets and writers who had survived. And they sat around and tried to figure out what words were left after this. He was their young charge. His name was Jonig Hosepian. The IAN on the last name of Armenians means son of. So if you're Hosepian, you're the son of Joseph. If you're the Topalian, you're the son of the crippled one, because Topal means crippled. If you're Medzvorian, it means you're the son of someone who had a big rear end in the family. This is the way the Turks kind of classified the Armenians, and they shared a sense of humor and other things before the genocidal kind of madness took place. So my grandfather had a choice. There was a rich railroad magnate, an Armenian, who was willing, given his literary bent and his early kind of poetry, was going to send him to Paris, to the Sorbonne. And he actually got a pen name from these Armenian writers. Johnny Hosepian became Aram Aurochs. And Aurochs is the mother river that runs down from Mount Ararat. So he took the pen name. I think we're the only Aurochs in the world. And it's nice to know that we're named after a river that comes from Mount Ararat. So he was going to go to Paris, and then these letters started coming from his uncle, who was the only surviving patriarch in the family. And this uncle had escaped Turkey after his wife and 2 children were massacred, went to Bulgaria, where he took offense at some co-workers who were Turkish and killed them, and then fled to America, to California, to Fresno, in the middle of the San Joaquin Valley. And he started writing letters to my grandfather. And this was 1920, and agriculture was starting to boom. Fresno was already known as the raisin capital of the world. And the letters, each one more blood red than the one before, kept arriving. You must come here. It's a new Armenia, a new Eden. The grapes, they hang like jade eggs. And the watermelons are so big that you eat the meat, and then you could float down the irrigation canals in them. So my grandfather had a choice, Paris or Fresno. Needless to say, he chose the latter. When he was senile, he imagined that he had gone to the Sorbonne. And he said, and this is how his mind was working, he said that the co-eds greeted him without any clothes on top. And the palm trees hung with legs of lamb. So he became a fruit tramp, a farmer, but he was not a good farmer. These things called vine hoppers ate all his raisin crop. Back then, you could actually be a fruit tramp, save your money for 3-4 years, and buy a farm. Can't happen today, of course. So sometime in the Depression, after the vine hoppers ate, he went to San Francisco, became a greengrocer. During the World War II, the shipyards were being built in Albany and Richmond. And all those shipyard workers would come to his stores. And then at some point he came back to the valley and bought a ranch along the San Joaquin River. That ranch was sold before I was born. They went into the grocery business, a chain of markets called Peacock. I remember the wonderful iridescence of that sign. Okay, it was beautiful. It was all illuminated. And then Safeway came to Fresno, and they couldn't compete. And one by one, we lost the Peacock markets. My dad came home one day and said, I bought a restaurant. He quickly figured out that food was a tough way to make a go. So he converted it into the hottest nightclub between San Francisco and LA. When I was a kid, Chuck Berry came to our bar to play. I begged my dad to go. I was just 12. He said no. And I heard that Chuck Berry did his famous duck walk across our little stage there. And 5 months later, he went off to work one night, and it was a foggy night, day after New Year's, and we got a call that 2 men had come in and shot him, and no one knew why. And they never figured out why, the police. And that was the beginnings of my first book. I started at 12, 13, 14, carrying around a tape recorder. Not sure what I was doing, but asking questions of family, trying to fill that hole that my father left with history. And that's how I got all my grandfather's story. And he told me he had joined the Communist Party in Berkeley. He went into a bookstore and ordered, became a subscriber to a progressive weekly. And the FBI began to follow him, and they followed him for 50 years. He was wearing a diaper, they were still following him. And I ended up, in that first book, I said, Grandpa was 88, I said, Grandpa, I'm gonna write a letter to the Department of Justice. I need you to sign it. We're gonna get your FBI file. Okay. So he signed it. A year later, he died. And 2-3 years later, my grandmother calls and says, a big package has arrived from the Department of Justice. And I said, yeah, and she says, yeah, do you know what this is about? And I had to think, Jesus, that's Grandpa's FBI file. I said, Grandma, do not open it, I'll be right there. So I went there, and it was 1,040 pages. But much of it was redacted. It was just all, but I saw that they had started following him in Berkeley in the 40s, kept on until, 1990. And it was ludicrous, some of the things I could read. He would give a speech at a Labor Day picnic along the Kings River, and it was all in Armenian. And then the FBI, they always did this in pairs. They said, Aurochs, subversive, and it said, he delivered a speech just before people started circle dancing. And then he went down and got a shish kebab sandwich at the thing. So this was the extent of the surveillance. This is what happened. So I published that first book in my father's name in '96, and a year later, the flood of 1997 hit Fresno. And a colleague of mine, the LA Times, called from Sacramento, and he said, you gotta check out Tulare Lake. Tulare Lake has come back to life. I said, what the hell is Tulare Lake? He says, grab the map. So I grabbed the map, and on the map, sure enough, there was this thing called Tulare Lake. But it was drawn on the map as a square, and it wasn't blue. So I ended up that day getting in the car and driving out Highway 41 past Hanford to a place called Corcoran, and kept following this dirt road, and the dirt road led to a levee, and I climbed up the levee, and there in the middle of cotton country was a lake that had come back to life. It was like being at the, and you could smell the air changed. And I looked out, and there were pelicans stabbing at catfish. The speed with which nature had found itself was a wonder. 3-4 days, it had come back. And I looked at the telephone poles. This was a cotton field, just for miles and miles, cotton. And the telephone poles, if you looked closely, showed the stain marks of the previous floods. So Tulare Lake was the biggest body of fresh water west of the Mississippi. It was the most dominant feature on the California map, 800 square miles. The Yokuts Indian, 4 distinct tribes of Yokuts lived along the shores. The women fished the lake with their feet. It was shallow. 4 rivers ran into it. This was before there were dams on those rivers. And in a flood year like this year, Tulare Lake would come back to life, and it would spread out. And they fished terrapin, turtle. And they served this turtle at the finest restaurants in San Francisco in the 1850s and 60s. What happened was the cotton plantations of the South were ravaged by the boll weevil. And some of those families decided to come west and start a new cotton plantation in the Tulare Lake Basin. So they picked some dry years, and they ended up diverting all those 4 rivers with canals and an irrigation system. And eventually they put pumps along those rivers and made the rivers run backward. And they were able to drain Tulare Lake and plant the biggest cotton plantation in the world, led by the Boswell family. And that became my second book that I wrote with a friend at the Wall Street Journal named Rick Wartzman. I'd been on the book for 2 years. Rick was covering the Clinton administration for the Wall Street Journal. Came out and said, how's that book doing? And I said, oh, it's going to take me 10 years. It's an epic story. And so we joined forces. It took us 5 years. And we wrote The King of California. And at the end of it, it was all about the water, that lake, these families, and how they had brought the cotton plantation culture to the West. Growing up, I always wondered, why did we feel like the South? And this book explained it to me. They brought their workers, they brought African Americans from the South to pick the cotton before they brought the Latinos. They brought their mint juleps. So that was a book that was born out of flood. Then I did a book of essays called The West of the West. 10, 11 stories. One of them happened to be my dad's murder being solved 30 years after, and the trial. And I'm not going to, that's a road we don't need to go down right now. But if you're curious about that, in West of West, that is the last story. Just how that happened 30 years later. Incredible coincidence and all sorts of other stuff. So I was sitting writing a novel in 2012 that was based on the lynching of an African American kid in the Valley in 2005. I call it a lynching. It was a lynching. There was no tree, though. They lynched him in a cotton field. And I tried to write it for the LA Times, but it was so graphic that they ended up dumbing it down. So I thought, okay, I'm going to write a novel about this. And then the drought happened. And these journalists were flying in from afar, and they were trying to write about Californian water. And I thought, I need to put my boots on again. This time, tell the story of drought and flood, not in the Tulare Lake Basin, but the entirety of California. And that's what I started to do. And this would be basically about how it started off as drought, then it became drought and flood. Then it became really the story of how we created California by bending water. The movement of water became the movement of man, became the movement of chemical, became the movement of bee. Okay, and so it became all of that. And you could see it's a pretty thick book. This is a bound galley. The Dreamt Land comes from a poem by Richard Wilbur. Wilbur was a Pulitzer Prize winner twice, wrote poems in the 50s, 60s, and 70s and 80s. He died while I was trying to think of a title, and I read a poem that he wrote, and I'll read you just the last part of it. Where eyes become the sunlight and the hand is worthy of water, the dreamt land, toward which all hungers leap, all pleasures pass. The subtitle is Chasing Water and Dust Across California, and that's literally what I did for 5 years. So I want to read you the prologue. You get a sense, this prologue was, so the drought is basically 212 to 216, 17. This is the summer of 2016. On a summer day in the San Joaquin Valley, 101 in the shade, I merge onto Highway 99 past downtown Fresno and steer through the vibrations of heat. I'm headed to the valley's deep south, to a little farm worker town in a far corner of Kern County called Lost Hills. This is where the biggest farmer in the world, the one whose mad plantings of almonds and pistachios have triggered California's nut rush, keeps on growing, no matter drought or flood. He doesn't live in Lost Hills. He lives in Beverly Hills. How has he managed to outwit nature for so long? The GPS tells me to take Interstate 5, the fastest route through the belly of the state, but I'm partial to Highway 99, the old road that brought the Okies and Mexicans to the fields and deposited a twang on my Armenian tongue. 99 runs 2 lanes here, 3 lanes there, through miles of agriculture broken every 20 minutes by fast food, gas station, and cheap motel. Tracks of houses, California's last affordable dream. Civilized 3 or 4 exits, and then it's back to the open road, splattered with the guts and feathers of chickens that jump ship on the slaughterhouse drive. Pink and white oleanders divide the highway, and every third vehicle that whooshes by is a big rig. More often than not, it is hauling away some piece of the valley's unbroken bounty. The harvest begins in January with one type of mandarin and ends in December with another type of mandarin, and in between comes everything in your supermarket produce and dairy aisles except for bananas and mangoes, though the farmers here are working on the tropical too. I stick to the left lane and stay ahead of the pack. The big rig drivers are cranky 2 ways, and the farm workers in their last leg vans are half asleep. 99 is the deadliest highway in America. Deadly in the rush of harvest, deadly in the quiet of fog, deadly in the blur of Saturday nights when the field work is done and the beer drinking becomes a second humiliation. 20 miles outside Fresno, I cross the Kings, the river that irrigates more farmland than any other river here. The Kings is bone dry as usual. To find its flow, I'd have to go looking in 1,000 irrigation ditches in the fields beyond. There's a mountain range to my left and a mountain range to my right, and in between a plain flatter than Kansas where crop and sky meet. One of the most dramatic alterations of the Earth's surface in human history took place here. The hillocks that existed back in Yokutt Indian days were flattened by a hunk of metal called the Fresno scraper. Every river busting out of the Serra was bent sideways, if not backward, by a bulwark of ditches, levees, canals, and dams. The farmer corralled the snowmelt and erased the valley, its desert and marsh. He leveled its hog wallows, denuded its salt brush, and killed the last of its Mustang antelope and Tulare elk. He emptied the sky of tens of millions of geese and drained the 800 square miles of Tulare Lake dry. He did this first in the name of wheat, then beef, milk, raisins, cotton, and nuts. Once he finished grabbing the flow of the 5 rivers that ran across the plain, he used his turbine pumps to seize the water beneath the ground. As he bled the aquifer dry, he called on the government to bring him an even mightier river from afar. Down the great aqueduct, by freight of politics and gravity, came the excess waters of the Sacramento River. The farmer commanded the distant flow. The more water he took, the more crops he planted. And the more crops he planted, the more water he needed to plant more crops. And on and on, 1 million acres of the valley floor, greater than the size of Rhode Island, are now covered in almond trees. I pity the outsider trying to make sense of it. My grandfather, a survivor of the Armenian Genocide, traveled 7,000 miles by ship and train in 1920 to find out if his uncle's exhortation, the grapes here are the size of jade eggs, was true. My father, born in a vineyard outside Fresno, was a great raisin grower before he became a bar owner. I grew up in the suburbs where our playgrounds were named after the pioneers of fruit, and irrigation canals shot through our neighborhoods to farms we did not know. For half my life, I never stopped to wonder how much was magic, how much was plunder. So, that was 2016. This book starts in 2014. One day I go out of my backyard, and I've done my best to become a suburban farmer. I've got all sorts of fruit trees, Santa Rosa plum, made by Luther Burbank in his lab in the 1890s, okay? This guy was incredible. They called him the wizard. He created so many crops by bending genes and things like that. The Alberta peach, incredible old-style peach, mandarins, and these apricot trees. Apricot trees are, their Latin name is Armenian something. They're like the only thing the Armenians can claim in terms of fruit. It's ours, the apricot. And I make sun jam, and I make some pretty good sun jam. And I went out on a January day, and I couldn't believe what I saw. There were blossoms on my apricot tree, 6-7 weeks early. You know, what to call this new season? It really wasn't winter. So I know that a lot can go wrong between the winter and the summer when you're picking this stuff. So I didn't quite count my mason jars yet. But I thought we'd have a good crop. They're loaded, and the flowers turned into little nubs, and the nubs started to grow. And then one day, I think it was in early to mid-March, I go out and I look, and my 3 apricot trees are weightless. They've been stripped of everything. And all those nubs, about this big, had fallen at the trunk of the trees. What's going on here? You know, I've got squirrels, but no squirrel could account for that. I've got possums, no possum can do that. My son, the youngest, who's an athlete, he could have been throwing a football back there, or baseball, but not this. So I couldn't figure it out. So I called my friend, Brad Gleason, who's a big farmer. He farms about 10,000 acres of nuts. And I said, and Brad and I have had a relationship that goes back to high school, and whenever I needed to know something true about what was going on in the fields, Brad would tell me the truth. He was my agrarian kind of source. I said, Brad, you're not going to believe this. My apricots shed every piece of fruit overnight, I think. And he said, he was on the phone, he said, let me show you my nuts. Pistachios and almonds, he meant. So off we went to the far west side of Fresno, where some of his nut trees are at. And I remember it's a place called Pleasant Valley. There's no groundwater there, but the water is shipped in. That's that Sacramento River water I told you about, and it allows farming that takes place there. So he grabs a stick, a branch, and he goes into this pistachio orchard. And this is a weird orchard. Pistachios are weird because it's planted with male and female. So for every male, there's 24 females. And the male's trunk, I don't know if this is kind of a joke with the farmers, but it's painted rooster red. And, you know, they call it agriculture's version of a harem, okay? 24-1. And he's hitting the pods on the male plants, the trees. And he's saying the females are ready, the males aren't. The synchronicity's off. I've never seen this before in 30 years. And he was silent, and we kept walking deeper into the orchard. And then he stood and he just shook his head. I said, what is it? And he said something that no farmer dare utter. He said, it's climate change, global warming. He says, you know why your apricot trees shed? The winter didn't have enough chilling hours. The fruit tree needs to know death before it could create life. The same with his pistachios. They were off sync. The next thing I heard was this whine of these engines. And I looked, and there were these guys up and down Brad's orchard on 3-wheelers. And they were blowing out of the end of a like your gardener, you know, blows. They were blowing this stuff. And I said, Brad, what is that? He said, it's semen. They were going to artificially inseminate and see if the females were willing. And that's the kind of level of bending and manipulation that went on. So I decide then that I'm going to write a book. And I'll do a little reading, just kind of giving you a sense of how I've thought it would be in the beginning. The rain stopped falling. And now winter, the season of winter is gone. What to blame on man-made global warming? What to blame on the arid West? You can check the diaries of John Sutter, our first reinvented man, or go back to the tree rings in the redwood forest. Drought is California. Flood is California. One year our rivers and streams produce 30 million acre-feet of water. The next year, they produce 200 million acre-feet. The year we hit near average, 72.5 million, is an aberration. The greatest daily flow of our watersheds surpasses the least daily flow by 500 times. Here in California, Mother Nature doesn't need man to deliver climate change. She does a swell job, all by herself. My assumptions at the outset are few. Water binds us and pulls us apart. A land this crazy makes people crazy. 100 million acres takes a while to screw up. Highest mountain, lowest desert, longest coast, most epic valley, riparian forest, redwood forest, Douglas fir forest, wetland, grassland, and inland sea. The rain falls 125 inches in one place and 7 inches in the other place. When the lines of latitude cover 10 degrees and the topographical regions number 11, what are a people to do? They can honor the distinctions and allow each region to exist within its own plenitude and limit. Or they can draw a line around the whole, count it as one state, and begin their infinite tinkering to even out the differences. We chose the latter, of course. Outside, I can hear the hydraulic tribes of California's north, middle, and south warring again over water's spoils. In my lifetime alone, the population of California has nearly quadrupled, 14 million to 40. And the constituencies have only grown more adamant in their claims to the snowmelt. The impulse to water warring, for all I know, may be a congenital trait. When it came time to populate the 1,000 miles of our nation's state, we planted 70% of the people at the southern end where only 30% of the water was made. This wasn't misplaced people, we told ourselves. This was misplaced rain. In our resolve to move those molecules of water to where the crops and houses grew, California pulled off the ultimate sleight of hand. Naturally, performing magic of that kind, people have come to believe that all manner of diversions are possible. The hydraulics we created are an engineer's delight. So how can a system of such infinite gesture now be turning against us? So the book starts in present day, and then it goes to the past, the building of this system, the most gargantuan, magnificent system to move water from where it is to where it isn't. And the history begins with Father Serra in 1769. The great missionary. He arrives in San Diego. The taking of California's first resource then happens, and that resource happens to be the body of the native. And by taking the body of the native, they're able to divert the first rivers, plant the first crops, and create the first culture. In 1839, a man named John Sutter arrives. He's fleeing debt in Switzerland. He leaves behind his children, 4 or 5 different accounts, his wife, and he makes it here with a bunch of library books and a uniform. It's a counterfeit uniform. He calls himself the captain, Captain John Sutter. And he finds his way to San Francisco, known then as Yerba Buena, and he meets with the governor of Mexican California. Mexico now has taken over from Spain, and they are running California. But they're running it with kind of hands off. They haven't really populated, they haven't brought a whole lot of folks here to mine the riches of California. And he strikes a deal with the governor. He's going to go not along the coast, where everybody likes to be. He's going to go to the interior, the land of the tules, those bulrushes that come up from all those marshlands. And he's going to be the founder of a new Switzerland. This happens outside of Sacramento. He takes his boat in. He's with some Hawaiian natives that he's brought with him. Some folks from San Francisco. They go in and he settles, and he is the first settlement in the interior. He is the king, the father of California, they say. The king. And things are going well. He builds a fort. He's hired so many Indians. He's actually paying them with these coins. They're working. This is a time when 9 million acres of California are owned by 500 men, mostly Californios, which are a mix of Spanish and Mexican. They had the ranchos. And then Sutter. Sutter owns something along the lines of 80,000 acres. Then he decides to build, to dam the Sacramento River, or the American River. He sends some people up there, and this is what happens next. How are we on time right now? Where are we at? That's not a... Okay. What is gold but a vein? What is water but the blood that runs inside a vein? The mining of gold is the mining of water first. The second taking of California begins in the same water that Sutter turned into wheat. A man in Sutter's employ is standing in a ditch alongside the American River, 50 miles upstream from Sutter's fort. This is where foothills meet Serra. The man is building a lumber mill for New Helvetia. That's what Sutter called his place. That utilizes the same mechanics of river diversion and flow as the flour mill. He has been working on the project for 7 months, and the structure is nearly done. It is the next piece in Sutter's empire, the one that will guarantee him a decade of building to come. The man, James Marshall, a New Jersey boy who is trying to start over. He gets through winter with his rifle, blanket, crackers, and venison. He oversees 40 Indians who put up a brush dam in the river and cut a ditch through a sandbar at the rear of the mill. At night, he raises a gate and lets the water run strong to flush out sand and gravel. And now it is the clear, cold morning of January 24th, 1848. And his men are eating breakfast, and he shuts off the flow and lets the water sink back into sand. He ventures a few steps into the ditch, and his eye catches a glimpse of something shining in the shallow water. He reaches down and picks it up. It is half the size of a pea. He can feel his heart thump. A few yards away, he sees the glint of another half pea. Could it be? Could it be? No, the gold he knows, the gold of a coin has a reddish tinge. This is more like brass. He sets the pieces on a hard rock and anvils down on them. The metal bends the way he's heard gold bends. He suddenly thinks the whole world might be watching. So he lodges the pieces inside a rag and stuffs the rag in his pocket and lets a week pass in which another phase of Sutter's lumber mill is completed. Then he leaps on his horse in a flood rain and rides back to the fort to show the captain Sutter. He brings his pieces back. Sutter closes the door. He dashes into a shop, applies nitric acid to the metal. The liquid fails to disturb the metal in the least. Gold. He grabs a volume of his Encyclopedia Americana, flips through the pages until he reaches gold. He reads about its properties, hustles a scale and a $3.50 in silver from some of his men. Sutter and Marshall perform a simple gravity test. Gold, but not just any, 23-karat gold. The two men agree to be partners in gold's first dibs. They seem almost frightened by its implications. They swear themselves to silence. But through the crack in a door, 3 Mormons who worked at the fort had heard all the talk. And Sam Brannon, who was one of the higher-ups in the Latter-day Saints, ends up taking some of this gold to San Francisco. And he's whooping it up, going down one of the busiest streets of early San Francisco. He's got a quinine bottle filled with these gold flakes. The Lord's tithing. He begins to shout, "Gold, gold, gold from the American River." It made for a perfect banner headline. This is a shout that reached all across the United States to the New York Herald, and then it reached the world. Gold jump-started this crazy experiment that we're in. And here's how I write about it. Another place gets the luxury of finding itself. Another place is made of many movements. It lurches forward and then backward depending on how the forward has gone. It invents, exploits, extracts, destroys. Between boom and bust, it catches its breath. Manifest destiny, as it moved across the plains, would have had its way with California eventually. In fits and starts, it would have done its reshaping and reconstituting. Riches would have been found and possessed by the few, mountains blasted, rivers dammed, rivers dispatched to places rivers never go. Wheat and then peaches and plums and grapes would have been planted, nuts and houses too. But here was a force of a different magnitude come down on the young history of a land. Gold's cataclysm hit the ground with suddenness, infused change with a warp speed, and in that blast of reinvention, no one had time to stop and ponder. Poor old John Sutter. He had hatched the dream of farm and city together, paid men in tin coins to build it high, and now he would watch it brought down by gold. California starts off jury-rigged and explosive, and it never settles down. It skips over normal, careens between extremes. It does not rest on the steady of farming. It does not rest on the steady of city building. The volatility of its nature rubs off on the people from wherever they come. They must conquer a place of too much. Is it any wonder they employ the implements of too much? 80,000 gold seekers arrived by ship, wagon, and foot in 1849 alone. Overnight they came. They were all mad. The Frenchman, the Chinaman, the Chilean, the Hindu, the Mexican, the German, the Russian, the Italian, the Greek, the Irishman, the Welshman, and the Digger Indian. Maddest of them all. They came with no plan, Only the Chilean who had mined back home knew what he was doing. The rest had no idea where they were going or what they were digging into with the tools they bought at wildly inflated prices at Sam Brannan's general store. They were preachers, lawyers, doctors, cooks, millwrights, blacksmiths, cobblers, soldiers, philosophers, poets, killers, dancers, prostitutes, and school teachers. So, the gold rush happens, and the mining of the water, the movement of water begins. They weren't canals and ditches, they were those sluices built out of wood that took all that water and moved it around, because the more water you brought to the mother lode, the more you could excavate. And then they created hydraulics. They put a spray nozzle on the end of the hose, and they were able, I don't know if any of you have seen those incredible photos of mountains being washed away in California gold country in the 1840s and 50s, 1850s and 60s and 70s. All that stuff then came down the rivers and clogged them up. And in the 1880s, we had one of the first environmental cases in the nation. The farmers sued the gold companies and won. And essentially that was the death of gold mining, that kind of crazy extraction. And it was the beginning of farming. The farming at first was big too. It was almost like industrialized gold became industrialized farmer. The same industrialists who made money off the gold were now planting wheat. These were guys who lived on Nob Hill in San Francisco. Chapman, Miller, Friedlander, Germans who had come, made their riches in gold, and now were extracting the soil. They were mining the soil. They started then acquiring land along the rivers using various means, various government programs that they subverted the intent. Henry Miller, the cattle king, lived in San Francisco. He owned both sides of the San Joaquin River. Miller owned and controlled millions of acres of land. It was said that he could ride from San Francisco to the Oregon-Canadian border and never sleep a night on land that wasn't his. And then there was a gentleman named James Ben Ali Hagan, a lawyer who had come from the South, part Turkish, part American Southern. And he ended up buying huge acres along the Kern River. And these two men came to a battle over who owned the river. One had land along the river, so he had riparian rights. The other had taken the water from the river, this is James Ben Ali Hagan, and moved it miles and miles away via ditches, and that was appropriative rights. These two things on their face were irreconcilable. They went to court, and the California courts ruled that both those laws would somehow be wedded and rule California. And that's why we have such a kind of schizophrenic water law here. I'm really dumbing this down. Do a little bit better job in the book. In 1920, when my grandfather arrives, the turbine pump is invented. And this allows the farmers who have now taken the rivers to go deeper into the ground. And this begins, once the cities have used their own rivers and taken 90 to 100% of them for farming, then the cry becomes, we need to steal the river. And the example was LA stealing from the Owens Valley 200 miles away. That became the precursor to the Central Valley Project, the system that then took the Sacramento River and moved it to the center of California first, and then later on, the State Water Project took Sacramento River water and moved it to the middle of California and into LA and down to here. This was the system that was built. So we start off with these Goliaths of wheat. Then we start moving to a smaller culture of farming in the middle. And then the footprint of agriculture starts to move out. As the pumping gives them more water, they move out from prime land to now more problematic land. So the book then finishes the building of the system, and then it starts with the part that I call Children of the Desert. And the first chapter is called The Kingdom of Wonderful, and I just want to read you a little bit about that. This is the Stuart and Linda Resnick chapter. So it's 8 weeks before the big nut shake, and I'm zigzagging through the middle of almonds and pistachios and Lost Hills. And it's square mile after square mile of these immaculate orchards strung with micro-irrigation systems that spit in the face of drought. These are trees that belong to Resnick, the richest farmer in America, who lives in Beverly Hills, as I said, on Sunset Boulevard, and calls his domain on this side of the mountain the Wonderful Company. I pull into an almond grove and I start shaking the trees. They're just heavy with nuts. Of all the wonders of Wonderful, this is the one I find most mystifying. The state water project that allowed western Kern County, where Lost Hills is, to grow into a farming behemoth has bequeathed no water or very little water over the past 3 years. So there's no water coming from the state. And this is land that has no groundwater to extract, unlike so much of the middle of the state. So it's gambler's ground, unlike any other in California. And as I'm driving from hill to dale, examining each of these orchards, my head spins. How can this be? No rain in 5 years, state water dwindling year after year, no water in the ground to make up for the missing government supply. So why hasn't this place gone to tumbleweeds? How can another record crop be sitting pretty on these trees? I do all these calculations. Resnick, in a very controversial move years earlier, had acquired something called the Kern Water Bank. It was a state project that all of us paid $74 million for, but the state couldn't quite get it going. And in this backroom deal in a place in Monterey, in the Monterey agreements, where a bunch of things were talked about, trading water, selling water, Resnick was able to get the Kern Water Bank. And this allowed for the planting of millions of trees on ground that had no groundwater. But the water bank had also run out in year 4 and 5 of the drought. So we had no water there. So I'm driving and I come across a wonderful field man in a 4x4 white truck. He listens to my bewilderment. How can a record crop be happening? He takes pity on me. As he drives off, he throws a clue out the window. Turn on Twisselman Road off I-5, continue west until it intersects with the California Aqueduct. There, he tells me, in the shadow of the state's great concrete artery, moving snowmelt north to south, I will find a private, off-the-book pipeline that Stuart Resnick has built to keep his trees from dying. The water is being taken from unsuspecting farmers in an irrigation district in Tulare County, more than 40 miles away. No stranger enters this zone unless it's to get rid of a body or dump waste from cooking meth or drown a hot car. Its vastness makes you feel safe and in jeopardy at the same time. I head straight into the glare of the sun shooting over the coast ranges. Through the haze, I can see the knoll of the aqueduct come closer. Ever since I was a kid, I have felt its pull, a strange gravitational presence on the land and in my own story. On a fog-dripped night in January 1972, 2 men wearing gloves walked into my father's empty bar and shot him to death. They dumped their stolen car and a .38 caliber revolver into the canal's black water and got away with murder for the next 30 years. In a valley of dead rivers, each one killed on behalf of agriculture, the aqueduct was the one river still alive. Its artificiality had achieved a permanence. Its permanence had created my California. I pull over into the dirt of a pomegranate orchard. The ancient fruit the Resnicks have turned into palm wonderful. The sweet purple juice inside a swell upon swell bottle. The shiny red orbs, 3 months shy of harvest, pop out from the bright green leaves like bulbs on a Christmas tree. I studied the terrain. This must be the spot the wonderful field man was describing. Sure enough, cozied up next to the bank of the small aqueduct, I catch a glint. I get out of the car and walk down a small embankment. There before me, 2 aluminum pipes, side by side, 12 inches in diameter each, slither in the sun. Where gravity needs a boost, the pipes run atop wooden crates used to pack boxes of fruit. Where the pipes butt up against Twisselman Road, a more clever bit of engineering is required. Here, a crew of men have dug a culvert beneath the road and hiked the pipeline under the asphalt that divides one field from another. Here, private water from Tulare County and Kings County jumps to Kern County. But government jurisdictions don't count. On one side of the road and the other, for miles in both directions, the dirt belongs to wonderful. I stand over the pipes and give them a hard slap. They slap back with the cold vibration of water. Where is it coming from? Who is it going to? The rest of that chapter, I just tell the story of the Resnicks. It's an incredible story. He's 81. He's gotten so big he doesn't know how big. He's the single biggest grower of almonds, pistachios, and pomegranates and citrus in the world. Last time he checked, he owned 180,000 acres in California. That's 281 square miles, almost the size of the 5 boroughs that make up New York City. He's using more water than any other person in the West. His 15 million trees in the San Joaquin Valley consume more than 400,000 acre-feet of water. The city of Los Angeles, by comparison, 4 million human beings, consumes 587,000. So it's really the story of Resnick is like those old Goliaths of wheat. He's like a throwback to them. He's never driven a tractor or cranked open an irrigation valve. He's never put his foot on the shoulder of a shovel, dug down into the soil. He truly wouldn't know one of his Valencia orange groves from one of his Washington navel orange groves. The land to him isn't real. It's an economy, a scale on a scale never tried. He grew up in New Jersey where his father ran a bar. He came to California in the 1950s to remake himself. Welcome to the club. He remade himself into a graduate of UCLA Law School, a cleaner of Los Angeles buildings, a vendor of security alarms, a seller of flowers in a pot, a minter of Elvis plates and Princess Diana dolls, a bottler of Fiji water, a farmer of San Joaquin Valley dirt. The Resnicks are really complicated. They're farming from afar, but they're also giving back to their workers in a way that no agricultural enterprise in the San Joaquin Valley has ever done. And the story really delves into those contradictions. I spent a lot of time on the land with the workers, both in Lost Hills and elsewhere, and I'm going to end my talk with a scene during the presidential election of 2016. It's a Saturday morning. I'm in the valley has 3 parts of it. There's the east side, the west side, and the center valley. The west side is extraction, big farms. The east side, smaller farms. But the center valley is really small farms. And the water level there is nice, so there's not a lot of extraction. And it's real communities. It's communities where farm workers and farmers, the children of farmers, go to school together and things like that. So it's not all big ag over there. You can't paint it with a broad brush. So I'm going to see the raisin harvest, which is something that's been going on for a century and a quarter. And I go to a place called Selma, which is the raisin capital of the world. It's really hot. The thermometer has shot past 100 degrees for 14 straight days. 3 farm workers have died in the heat. The vines haven't drunk water for 30 days, but that's by design because it makes it easier to lay those grapes into the road to dry. So I park my car down a dirt road that runs through the vineyard, and these Honda Civics on their 3rd owners line the path. I step onto the fine powdery loam and pick a dusty road to walk. Not a worker can be seen. All is quiet. A few yards inside this vineyard, I hear the faint sounds of banda and follow the music to a cell phone in the back pocket of a skinny young man. He's wearing worn cowboy boots, torn jeans, one long-sleeve shirt over the other, and a San Francisco 49ers cap splattered in grape juice mixed with dust. He parts the curtain of cane and leaf and steps completely inside the vine, hacking away at its purple bunches with one hand and letting the bunches plop into a plastic tub he holds with the other hand. It takes him 48 seconds to fill the tub. Then he bends over in the opposite direction and spills the fruit across a paper tray in the row's middle in the full sun. This is the oven where the grapes will bake. His name is Uriel, and he's 21 years old and a native Guerrero, the Mexican state where his family has lived forever in poverty. 4 years ago, after finishing the 9th grade, he decided to follow the trail that had sent his father and older brother north. He hired a coyote to get him past the border's barrier. The $4,000 fee was double the price from a few years ago, but there was no haggling. These weren't the coyotes of yesteryear. These exporters were now at the command of drug lords. 2 commodities, labor and heroin, crossed the border at once to satisfy America's twin lusts. I came here for a year, and then the year turned to another year and another year and another year, Uriel tells me. He shares an apartment in the Citrus Belt with 3 other farm workers who are here alone as well. He's able to work nearly year-round by picking oranges, olives, cherries, and grapes. Skinny and small, he's the perfect size to move in and out of the vines without any stooping to slow him down. The drive to the vineyard takes him 45 minutes in the dark, but he would have traveled even farther because this farmer pays by the piece. If he works through lunch, 9 hours straight, he will make more than the minimum wage. He will make 260 trays or $105. This is more than he would earn from an entire week's labor in Guerrero. In the best months here, he's able to send half his paycheck back home. The next row over belongs to Ponciano, who crossed the border by himself when he was 12 and has worked the last 8 years picking mandarins, blueberries, pears, and apples. This is his first stab at raisin grapes, and he finds the work miserable. He'll be lucky at day's end to have made 200 trays, $75. A handsome kid, seen it all eyes. Poncio says he is looking for a wife to keep him here. I know there are better days coming, he says. If I can help it, I will not go back. He whistles to Jose, deeper in the vineyard, to join him on their break. But Jose has arrived from Mexico only a few days before and owes $3,000 to a friend who covered his border crossing. My friend told me the grapes turn into gold in California, he says. I came to find out if that was true. The sun isn't quite overhead, but already feels like a furnace. There is one row where a grape picker has laid out the paper trays far in advance. This strategy strikes me as risky, for it has the potential to break a man's spirit, to underscore the quarter-mile row still to go to pick. But as I watch the tiny figure covered in a hoodie, hat, and bandana, I can see that it's ingenious, this plan. It allows the worker to build toward a trance of picking and filling and dumping that is never broken to put down one tray at one time. I walk over to introduce myself, and only then do I see that this picker is a woman. Her name is Maria, and she has been working in the orchards and vineyards for 11 years. Her husband works beside her. Together, they can make $175 a day. I don't work as fast as I used to, she tells me. I am 30 years old already. She had awakened at 3 a.m. to fix lunch for herself and her husband and to cook the food the babysitter will serve at home to their 3 children. During the harvest, this routine never varies. After work, she washes the stains off her hands and face and prepares dinner and gives the children a bath and tries to find a half hour to herself to think about something else. She thinks about her children who were born here as U.S. citizens and how they will learn English and go to college and never work a day in the fields. Will they allow us to stay? She asks, her voice pleading. His name had not come up, but she is speaking of the Republican candidate for president, Donald Trump, and all that he has unleashed in this country. He had held a rally in Fresno before the harvest, and growers cheered and waved farmers for Trump signs. Even some Mexican Americans had climbed aboard. It makes no sense to her. An edict that sends the workers back to Mexico and a wall that keeps them from returning. Who will pick the fruits and vegetables? How will the cities, much less the farms, survive? The man has a rock for a heart, she says. Let them build a wall, Uriel shouts from his row. We will be like Spider-Man and vault it. I'm afraid of heights, Ponciano says, laughing. We will be like gophers and tunnel underneath. Don't they know that they can't keep us out, Jose says, his face to the sun. We are Mexicans. Thank you.